1 large, 2 small vessels, one off the northern beach of Guadalcanal, 6 miles from Savo. We'll look into this more thoroughly. Lieutenant John A. Thomas, pilot of the cruiser, USSS San Francisco's Vought OS-2U Kingfisher scout plane, sent this message at the perfect moment. Admiral Norman Scott was relieved to hear the news aboard his flagship, as his Task Force 64.2 had spent the last few hours searching for the incoming Japanese force. It was intended to launch 4 Kingfishers to locate the enemy, but the cruiser Helena was not launched at all, and the cruiser Salt Lake City caught fire and crashed. Admiral Scott's task force waited for word from one of the cruisers, San Francisco and Boise, the only ones that were able to launch their spotter planes. The Battle of Cape Esperance was set to start at 10:50 p.m. on October 11, 1942, when contact was finally established. Tricks in the dark. The Japanese reinforcement group, composed of the seaplane carriers Chaitos and Nishin and their accompanying destroyers, was what San Francisco's scout plane had discovered. At 8 in the morning, these had departed the Shortland Islands. The seaplane carriers, led by Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, were en route to the Solomons' troubled island of Guadalcanal, which American and Japanese forces had occupied. Since the U.S., on August 7th, Marines arrived there and took control of the crucial airfield. 728 soldiers, 2 field guns, 4 howitzers, 6 landing craft, ammunition, and medical supplies were all transported by the Japanese ships. The swift and agile destroyers Akizuki, Asagumo, Natsugumo, Yamagumo, Murakumo, and Shirayuki protected their flanks. Admiral Scott was unaware at the moment, but another Japanese force was also approaching. Under the leadership of Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, the bombardment group, which included the destroyers Atsuyuki and Fubuki and the heavy cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, was sailing at 30 knots toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Goto's quick destroyers and cruisers would arrive at Guadalcanal because of their speed. The ships of Admiral Scott were already arranged in a combat line. Leading the charge were 3 destroyers, Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey. The destroyers Buchanan and McCullough were in the back of the formation, with the cruisers San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena forming the middle. The distance between each ship was between 500 and 700 yards. The moon had already set, so there was no ambient light, and the night was completely dark. The consequent loss of visibility made the distance between ships appear much shorter to the young officers of the deck on board the cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Scott gave the command to turn his column 180 degrees to course 230 at 11:32 p.m. He desired to be in a position to stop the incoming enemy force and to cover the area between Savo Island and Cape Esperance. The maneuver did not go as anticipated because of the tropical night's darkness. During the turn, the 3 top destroyers were dispersed from their formation. After making the 180-degree change, they were now on the same heading as the rest of the column, but not in line. Confusion would result from this in the upcoming conflict. Practicing for action at night. In 1917, a German U-boat destroyed the ship of the 53-year-old career naval commander Rear Admiral Scott, who had also served in World War I. In June 1942, he was assigned to sea duty after spending the months following Pearl Harbor stationed in Washington, D.C. Scott had not participated in the Battle of Savo Island, but he had been at sea off Guadalcanal on August 9th. Scott made sure his gunners got night fighting training because of the disaster the Allies had experienced at Savo, where the Japanese sank 4 cruisers. This was precisely what the Americans had been lacking in the Guadalcanal battle thus far. See WWI History magazine for further in-depth accounts of the Guadalcanal battle and the men who shaped its events. Admiral Scott trained his task force for a night action for 3 weeks. In order to replicate night combat and give sailors time to get used to a nighttime situation at sea, he maintained his ships at battle stations from sunset till sunrise. Scott understood that the next battle with the Japanese Navy would not be far off, so he intended to be ready. Both sides are confused. At 11:25 p.m., Helena initially established radar contact with the adversary, The target was 315 degrees and 27,000 yards distant. Helena had the latest SG radar, which gave its operators the ability to monitor the enemy more precisely and detect them at a greater range than the previous SC type. However, because San Francisco had the outdated SC radar, it had a harder time locating Goto's ships. In actuality, no echo was picked up by San Francisco's radar. Soon after, a transmission from Boise, which also had SG radar, was delivered by the TBS, talk between ships. Boise reported 5 bogeys with a bearing of 65 degrees. Once more, San Francisco's radar was picking up nothing, so Admiral Scott had to rely on the word of another ship. Boise had brought up the destroyers Hatsuyuki and Fujiki, the heavy cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, and the ships of Admiral Goto's bombardment group. However, her report just made matters more confusing. Bogies are unidentifiable aircraft, not enemy ships, according to nautical jargon. Furthermore, it was unclear from the 65-degree bearing if this was a true or relative bearing. The crucial distinction was that it was 65 degrees from Boise, and the remainder of the American formation would suggest that Helena had picked up the same contact. However, 65 degrees true would indicate that this was a completely different kind of encounter. Admiral Scott was uncertain about Boise's contact, since he was unable to infer anything from San Francisco's radar. Scott also considered the potential that the destroyers Duncan, Fahrenholt, and Laffey, which had split from the column during the 180-degree turn, may be Helena's contact, Boise's, or even both. "Are you taking station ahead?" Scott asked Captain Robert G. Tobin on board the Fahrenholt. "Yes," Tobin said in response. Duncan set off alone, rushing directly into Goto's cruisers and destroyers, coming up on your starboard side. In reality, only Fahrenholt and Laffey were traveling parallel to the main column. If Scott had known that Goto was as perplexed, it would have been a tiny comfort. He had to rely on his lookout's vision because he had no radar at all. Around 11,000 yards away, at 11:43, lookouts on board Aobad noticed the shadows of 3 ships nearly dead ahead. Goto didn't care. He assumed that the ships belonged to the reinforcement group under Admiral Joshima. Roger. Perplexity starts the Battle of Cape Esperance. This was a reasonable assumption at this point in the Guadalcanal War. Admiral Goto was well aware that the Americans were still not particularly good at night combat. It was a common myth that the Americans were scared to leave the house after dark following their crushing defeat in the Battle of Savo Island on the evening of August 9, 1942. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison observed, "From sunrise to sunset, the Americans controlled the waves. However, the Allied ships dispersed like terrified kids from a cemetery as the tropical twilight quickly faded out and night descended on Iron Bottom Sound." The ships in front of his column were not American, and Goto had no reason to think so. He instructed the flashing of the day's recognition signal at the 3 silhouettes after lowering the speed to 26 knots. The lookouts declared the ships to be enemy after the range had shrunk to roughly 7,500 yards. Goto was not persuaded that the ships were American. Even when action stations were sounded aboard Aoba, he gave the command to flash the recognition signal once more. Scott was also perplexed. He was still unsure, even with radar, if Boise and Helena had spoken with his own destroyers or enemy ships. Helena's gunners were completely certain. Lookouts reported ships visible to the naked eye when the range was reduced to 5,000 yards. Helena's captain, Gilbert C. Hoover, sent the signal "Interrogatory Roger" to San Francisco via TBS. Scott answered, "Hey Roger." Captain Hoover believed it to imply "open fire," or at least this is what he stated, and it signified "message received." Helena's primary battery of 6-inch guns and backup 5-inchers started firing at Goto's column at 11:46. Officially, the Battle of Cape Esperance had begun. Scott was stunned beyond belief. The other ships followed Helena as she opened up. Explosions seemed to burst from the entire column. The reports and muzzle flashes occasionally happened at the same time when the vessels started firing simultaneously. The Admiral was almost deafened by the concussion from San Francisco's guns, which literally took his breath away. While her crew was busy flashing the second recognition signal, Aobawas was struck by multiple rounds. The Japanese heavy cruiser was struck by 6-inch shells from Helena and Boise, 8-inch shells from San Francisco and Salt Lake City, and 5-inch shells from Laffey. The fire control director and 2 of Aoba's 8-inch turrets were knocked out, and the ship's communications were interfered with. Several officers and troops were killed by the impact of large-caliber shells that struck the flag bridge without detonating. Among those mortally injured was Goto. Scott unintentionally crosses the T. Scott was unaware that he had unintentionally performed the traditional naval maneuver of crossing the T when he made his 180-degree turn. Since he had moved his own ships across the bows of the advancing Japanese column, the enemy could only use its forward-firing guns in retaliation, while his cruisers and destroyers could fire as many guns as possible. At the Battle of Savo Island 2 months prior, he had also flipped the Allied ships' positions. Before the Japanese admiral realized he was engaged in combat, he had taken the enemy by surprise and struck Goto's ships with great force. Nevertheless, Scott was still unsure if his ships were firing at the enemy. He gave the command, "Cease firing our ships," at 11:47, but some captains did not hear it or chose to disregard it. The firing slowed, but did not completely stop. "How are you?" Scott questioned Captain Tobin aboard Laffey via TBS. The inquiry was somewhat unexpected, and Tobin said he was all right. "Are you the target of our bullets?" Scott continued. It was yet another unexpected query. "I don't know who you were firing at," Tobin replied. Scott was also in the dark. He requested that Tobin's destroyers flash the day's recognition signal, which consists of vertically aligned lights that are green over white. Every destroyer obeyed. Scott caught a glimpse of the lights flickering momentarily to starboard. When Scott was finally sure he wasn't shooting at his own ships, he gave the command, "Start shooting again," at 11:51. The night's first defeat. The Japanese also eventually realized they were up against enemy ships during the 4-minute pause. Aoba swung 180 degrees and accelerated, but the cruiser continued to be damaged by Japanese gunners' ineffective fire. A number of flames started when her foremast fell to the deck. One turret was still operational after roughly 40 strikes. Captain Kikonori Kijima, Goto's senior staff officer, was notified that Goto had suffered severe injuries and was now leading the bombardment group. Without having to worry about the other members of the group, Captain Kijima already had more than enough issues. Aoba's communications equipment was mostly out of commission, making it nearly impossible to communicate with the other ships in the widely dispersed column. Directing the movement of even one more ship from the crippled cruiser would not have been possible. The most direct escape path was to the northwest, therefore around 11:50 a.m. Aoba started to smoke and turned northwest. The captain of the Aoba aimed to avoid the American column as far as possible, far enough to allow for the re-establishment of connection with the other Japanese ships. There was absolutely no use in remaining near Scott's men at this point in the conflict. The heavy cruiser Furitaka is the ship in line behind Obawa. As soon as Scott's ship started firing, her commander, Captain Araki Tsutao, realized that an American force had ambushed his column. The easiest way out of the American gunfire was to move left, which was his first instinct. Tsutao made the decision to follow Goto's flagship when Oba went right. This was not a wise choice. Gunners on board Helena, San Francisco, and the other American ships redirected their fire to Furutaka, which was now the most convenient target while Oobare was hiding behind a smoke cover. 11:49, Furutaka started to take hits. A shell landed among the cruiser's torpedo tubes approximately 1 minute later. American gunners concentrated their fire on the ensuing explosion and fire, which formed a focal point. Both Helena and Boise were equipped with 5 3-gun turrets that could fire 30 rounds per minute and mounted 6-inch cannon. These swift-firing cruisers made round after round into Fujitaka alongside the other vessels in the column. She took many strikes below the waterline and was struck more than 90 times. She somehow maintained enough strength to keep moving forward in addition to staying afloat. Around 3/4 of a mile away, gunners and lookouts on board San Francisco saw an unknown ship during this time. San Francisco turned her searchlight on the unidentified ship, illuminating the white-banded second funnel and latticework foremast of a Japanese destroyer. The ship also flashed strange recognition signals, a combination of red and white lights, and also signaled some mysterious words or characters at the American column. Fubuki, the destroyer, was caught entirely unprepared. San Francisco's light flooded the ship, exposing it to Scott's whole column of cannons. Fubuki was the first ship to sink that night, after she was struck so many times that she stopped dead in the ocean and exploded. The American column burns. It was hardly a completely one-sided battle. The first American ship struck by enemy fire was the destroyer Duncan, which had charged into the enemy alone after breaking away from her column. She had just fired her guns at the Japanese and launched torpedoes into Furutaka when shells killed the torpedo officer and knocked out her fire control director. Without the main control's assistance, the chief torpedo man took over and fired a second torpedo. Whether this was wishful thinking or an illusion, observers said they saw the Japanese cruiser crumple in the middle, then roll over and disappear. Furutaka was still very much afloat and steaming forward on her own power. American and Japanese rounds collided with Duncan. In addition to blowing over the destroyer's forward funnel, the same shell ignited a fire in the ammunition management room at Number. Second Lieutenant Commander Edmund B. Taylor, Duncan's captain, activated the recognition lights after realizing that friendly fire posed an equal threat to his ship as hostile fire did. The lights were merely an aiming point, if anything. Scott's column was hit by 4 rounds, which instantly cut off the ship's power and jammed the rudder to the left. Duncan started to spin away of the battle area, with her rudder stuck. Additionally, Fahrenholt was awkwardly positioned between the American column and the enemy. Shells hit Fahrenholt's rigging around the same time Duncan was going through her trauma. Several crew members were killed when jagged shrapnel bits splattered the decks. A torpedo tube that was about to swing out for discharge was struck by one of the fragments. The torpedo was partially blown out of its mounting, and its electric motor was activated when the shrapnel entered the tube and entered the air flask. The torpedo did not explode, and no additional damage was caused, but the motor inside the tube kept running. A second shell destroyed the ship's fire control circuits and communications wiring as it passed through the port side of Fahrenholt, close above the waterline. The fire room was hit by a third shell. The crew was pushed up on deck by the burst of scalding steam. Given that both hull strikes were reported as apparently 6-inch and occurred on the port side, it is quite likely that American fire also struck Fahrenholt. The destroyer's list was now 5 degrees. She was taken out of the fight by her captain, Lieutenant Commander Eugene T. Seward, across the bow of San Francisco. A blind man's bluff game. 11:55, Scott aligned his column with the Japanese by turning it to the northwest. Boise, Helena, San Francisco, and Salt Lake City were the 4 cruisers that monitored targets and fired round after round, but it was hard to determine which Japanese ships were being shot upon at this point. A constant rate of fire was likewise maintained by the 2 rear destroyers, Buchanan and McCalla. According to Buchanan's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Ralph E. Wilson, he shot the works, firing 5 torpedoes and unleashing a continuous volley from his 5-inch main cannon. Lieutenant Commander William G. Cooper, who was on board McCalla, was shocked to discover that both ships' guns were still aimed fore and aft, after witnessing Aoba and Furutaka blazing. This was more proof that Goto had been caught completely off guard. At this point in the conflict, Scott's column had fallen into very ragged shape and was no longer in any kind of structure, according to one American writer. Although Scott was still unsure of the opposition force's strength, he was aware that he had struck it hard and was about to win. Although the SG radar aboard Boise and Helena did help, assessing the enemy's strength in the dead of night without the moon was not an easy assignment. The same author noted that the battle was still a game of blind man's bluff despite radar. Scott gave the order for all ships to stop firing at exactly midnight. Because of the haphazard way his column was strung, it was extremely impossible to distinguish friend from adversary. Once more, a few captains disregarded the directive and continued firing. Additionally, all ships were asked to line up in a column and flash their identification lights. All ships complied, with the exception of the wounded destroyers Duncan and Fahrenholt. The last ship to cease shooting was Boise. Due to a fire, her radar provided her gunners with a target that was also visible to everyone on topside. Boise ultimately complied with Admiral Scott's directive and allowed her gunners to relax when this ship vanished from radar and view. Captain Edward Moran brought the Boise line with the flagship after spotting San Francisco's recognizable lights up ahead. Boise accepts water. The Japanese force was prepared to give Scott all the fight he desired in return for his unwavering determination to pursue the enemy. Boise and Helen were both given an urgent notice at 12:06 a.m. Torpedoes approaching. The cruiser made a quick turn to run parallel to the two torpedoes after Captain Moran gave the order to hard right rudder. While the second came up on the starboard side and missed the stern by roughly 90 feet, the first one just cleared the port bow. When Boise adjusted her course and returned to the column, everyone on board felt relieved. The ship Kinugasa had fired both torpedoes. Kinugasa started firing at the American cruisers from 8,000 yards out 3 minutes after Boise and Helen were given the torpedo warning. Her first target was San Francisco. The flagship's crew was given a terrible surprise when a Japanese salvo hit in her wake. Kinugasa changed his objectives to Boise after firing one volley. Captain Moran reluctantly acknowledged that the ship was shooting very well. Boise had her searchlight focused on a target on her starboard beam when Kinugasa switched targets. The illumination provided the enemy gunners with a great point of aim. Boise witnessed a terrifying display of Japanese firearms for the following 3 minutes. She was forced to ditch her front turret after it was jammed by an 8-inch shell. 9 feet below the waterline, another shell entered the hull and detonated in the forward 6-inch magazine. The blast destroyed magazine and handling staff. The soldiers at the flood control station were dead when Moran ordered the forward magazines to be flooded. Boise seems on the verge of blowing apart. However, Boise and her crew were lucky. Tons of seawater were also released into the forward area by the shell that had caused the explosion, filling the magazines. The shell that killed the men at the flooding panel did what they could no longer do, despite their deaths. Moran maneuvered Boiseau of the column, pulling her abruptly to port and accelerating her speed to 30 knots in order to avoid any more damage. The ship would have been 50 to 100 yards away from the next salvo if she hadn't turned. Her 6-inch turrets fired at the attackers for 2 more minutes as the cruiser fled the battle. The show might not end. Both his observer and Lieutenant John Thomas remained in the air. From a unique vantage point, the 2 men aboard San Francisco's Kingfisher scout plane were able to observe the combat from a few hundred feet above it. They witnessed the American column cross the T, the Japanese force start to retaliate as tall splashes from Kinugasa's cannons landed in the wake of San Francisco, and the enemy being decimated by the American ship's gunfire. They witnessed the enormous orange explosion that erupted from Boise's forecastle. At 12:12, Thomas continued to circle over the battle and informed Scott of his position on board San Francisco. San Francisco started firing at Kinugasa with radar-controlled gunfire after Boise left the column. Salt Lake City also fired at the Japanese cruiser, striking her once while being hit twice by Japanese gunners. A fire caused by one of the shells killed multiple troops and seriously damaged the cruiser's electrical systems. Scott gave the command to alter the course to 330 degrees. The night action had slackened, but his goal was to press the Germans. The Japanese were making every effort to leave the fighting area, but the Admiral was not yet prepared to break off operations. "Stand by for further action," he said to his captains shortly after changing direction. The show might not end yet. However, it was. In an effort to put as much space between themselves and the American force as possible, Aoba, Kinugasa, and Hatsuyuki were steaming off to the northwest by 12:20. Furutaka was hampered by the damage she had sustained and fell behind. The Fubuki destroyer has already sunk. Calculating the toll, Boise had sustained the most damage out of all the American ships. By 12:19, her forecastle fire was out, but 2 turrets remained ablaze. These fires were extinguished as well, although the bodies obstructing one of the turret's hatches made the task considerably more challenging. The cruiser's damage control crews persisted in their efforts and overcame all obstacles. All fires were out by 2:40 a.m., and the shell holes in her hull were sealed. Although Boise had suffered 107 fatalities and 29 injuries, she returned to Scott's column at 20 knots at 3:05 a.m. Because his task force had sunk 2 American cruisers, Captain Kikonori Kijima assured the dying Goto aboard Ooba that he could pass on to the next world with an easy mind. This could have been wishful thinking, or it could have been an attempt to cheer up a dying man. However, Captain Kijima's statements were not accurate at all. He might have mistaken Fahrenholt for a cruiser and believed that the Boise had sunk. In actuality, Fahrenholt did not sink, despite being severely damaged and consuming water. By shifting enough ballast to generate a 9-degree list to starboard, the crew was able to bring the shell holes on the port side below the waterline and out of the water. At a speed of 20 knots, Fahrenholt set a course to the southeast, temporarily safe from inundation. She was safely escorted back to base at Noumea by her escort, the recently arriving destroyer Aaron Ward. Duncan's performance was not quite as good. Fires burned continuously enough to ignite the 20mm ammunition in the gun mounts, making them impossible to extinguish. Lieutenant Commander Taylor, her captain, ordered her to leave the ship. He and the other survivors watched from lifeboats as their ship, still burning and exploding from the munitions, drifted steadily away from them. Lieutenant Herbert R. Cabot, the senior officer on board, considered beaching Duncan on Savo Island to prevent her from sinking while a small group was still on board. He changed his mind and chose to try to salvage the destroyer by putting out the fires when they started to go out. However, the after-fire room was inaccessible due to the fires, so there was no steam, no power, and no pumps to dry the ship. Duncan finally slowed to a halt. The destroyer was finally abandoned around 2 a.m. The 195 sailors and officers who survived saw their ship burn in the dark. There were 48 dead sailors. When a salvage team from McAllister boarded Duncan, they attempted to save her once more, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The destroyer sank 6 miles north of Savo Island just before noon. The unexpected role of savior was played by Michaela's crewmen. However, the guys they saved were Fubuki survivors who refused to be saved. 3 Japanese sailors were seized by Michaela's crew and violently dragged on board after lines were given to them, but the men refused to accept them and refused to surrender. The others favored sharks or drowning over enemy rescue. The destroyer Hatsuyuki saved the majority of Furitaka's survivors when she too went down. At 2:28 a.m., 22 miles north of Savo Island, the Furitaka sank after being repeatedly hit by gunfire from multiple American cruisers and by 1 or more torpedoes from either Duncan or Buchan. Aobadi didn't sink. She retired up New Georgia Sound on her own initiative after having been struck over 40 times. After reaching the shortlands at around 10 in the morning, she was sent home for extensive repairs. Overwhelming air power. Joshima's reinforcement group was landing its troops, supplies, and 150mm howitzers on Guadalcanal, close to Cocombona, while Scott's cruisers and destroyers were roughhousing Goto's bombardment group. The reinforcement group had completed its work and was steaming out of Guadalcanal by 2:30. The Battle of Cape Esperance was reported to Joshima, and survivors are rescued from Goto's task group by the detachable destroyers Shirayuki and Murakumoto. 400 Japanese were rescued from the sea by the 2 destroyers combined. However, before they could escape the area, 11 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal discovered them at 8:20 a.m. Although there were no direct strikes, a near miss caused Murakumo's fuel tank to burst. Soon after, a second, much larger, airstrike occurred. This group of aircraft had 14 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, 6 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and 13 SBDs. One of the TBFs struck Murakumo with a torpedo, depriving her of power, while the SBDS did minor damage from close hits. Joshima dispatched 2 additional destroyers, Asagamo and Natsumo, to rescue the rescuers as soon as he learned of the airstrike and its outcomes. Around 3:45 p.m., another American airstrike arrived, bringing with it 8 Wildcats, Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters, and 11 SBDS and TBFS. Instead of finding 2 destroyers, these planes discovered 4. Natsumo and Murakumo were killed in the water after she was struck directly and 8 times. The engine rooms and other compartments quickly filled with water due to the near misses. With 16 crew members and her commander remaining on board, the Nazugu sank at 4:27. Asagumoto rescued the survivors. Asagumo and Shirayuki, both crowded with survivors, sailed for their mooring in the Shortland Islands after Shirayukire evacuated everyone from the severely wounded ship and destroyed her sister destroyer with a single long-lance torpedo. Murakumo was a stationary target for the SBDS and was also hit directly. Hours before, the rest of the bombardment and reinforcement groups had already departed for the Shortlands. 30-minute combat. By daytime, the majority of Task Group 64.2 had been en route to Espiritu Santo. On board Salt Lake City and Boise, repairs had already begun. Fahrenholt was moving quickly and said she didn't need help. Thomas had made a safe landing on the little island of Tulagi after watching the action from San Francisco's Kingfisher plane. In the battle on October 12, 1942, the Japanese lost 3 destroyers and a heavy cruiser, and about 450 people were killed. 8th Fleet headquarters at Rabaul initially would not accept the casualties, but after Furutaka, Fubuki, Natsugumo, and Murakumori did not return, Japanese top commanders were left with no other option. During the night battle, Captain Kijima, the chief of staff of Admiral Goto and the bombardment group's successor, asserted that his force had sunk a destroyer and 2 American cruisers. He was relieved of command right away. However, Admiral Tamaki Ugaki, the chief of staff of the combined fleet, did not utilize Captain Kijima as a scapegoat and instead attributed Goto's downfall on general negligence. He was definitely right. Goto's troops would have been far more ready for the impending battle if he had not disregarded his lookout's warnings of hostile ships. According to Morrison, Scott became the hero of the South Pacific during the short month that remained in his valiant life. His subordinates stated that they had sunk 3 Japanese cruisers and 4 destroyers together before his death on November 13th during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Scott was tempted to dismiss this assessment as wishful thinking. The Battle of Cape Esperance cost the Americans 1 destroyer, Duncan, sunk, another, Fahrenholt, damaged, and 2 cruisers, Boise and Salt Lake City, damaged, despite the fact that they had caused the Japanese far more losses. Additionally, the men and equipment belonging to Admiral Joshima's group had landed in Guadalcanal. The New York Times published an article with the headline, 30-minute combat, our ships sink cruiser, 4 destroyers, and transport at night, on October 13, 1942. The article continued. The Navy Department announced tonight that United States warships sank 1 Japanese heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, and a transport in a midnight battle with Japanese warships in the Solomon Islands and thwarted an enemy attempt to land more troops on Guadalcanal. Although the account was mostly wishful thinking, it was more factual than the version provided by Scott's subordinates. A morale-boosting win. Following the Battle of Cape Esperance, the U.S. The Navy was now aware that they could defeat the Japanese severely in addition to fighting the enemy at night. The Japanese reinforcement runs, known as the Tokyo Express, were no longer entirely safe in the shadows. The U.S. had regained the confidence that had been severely eroded at Savo Island. Additionally, the Americans learned a lot about using radar and night tactics. However, Cape Esperance demonstrated the necessity for a far more comprehensive understanding of radar, which resulted in the creation of new radar and night warfare training programs. The Americans had achieved a much-needed triumph thanks to a combination of luck, planning, and technology. At the very depth of this winter of our discontent came the battle off Cape Esperance, which, if far short of glorious summer, gave the tired Americans a heartening victory and the proud Japanese a sound spanking, Morrison said in his summary of the fighting's conclusion.